Okay, Year 11, this is the second video on Macbeth, and this video focuses on the change in Lady Macbeth's character. So the first quotation I'm going to go through with you is this one from Act 1, Scene 5. I may pour my spirits in thine ear and chastise with the valour of my tongue. And this takes place in, as I said, Act 1, Scene 5 is our introduction to Lady Macbeth's character. She's speaking alone at her home at the Macbeth's castle, and she's kind of speaking in soliloquy after reading Macbeth's letter. It's worth noting that immediately her reaction is this kind of ruthless ambition, almost as if this ambition and aspiration had always been pent up inside her, and now that there is possibly a means to kind of achieve the power that she'd always dreamt of, it's almost kind of boiled over and spilling out in this quite kind of violent and very explicit soliloquy, or kind of couple of soliloquies that she delivers within this scene and later on. Also worth noting is that Lady Macbeth's life is framed by isolation. So at the beginning of the play, she's completely on her own in this scene, and then later on when she dies, she's also completely on her own, almost as if she's kind of imprisoned, you know, in this archetype or this kind of convention cage of Jacobean femininity. So she's imprisoned in her own womanliness, or the expectations of women at the time. She's imprisoned by her isolation and also by those expectations. She begins alone and passive, and though she's speaking about power and control, she's speaking in soliloquy. So she's essentially just talking to herself. No one's listening. And again, at the very end, no one is listening to her at the very end either. And she constantly struggles against this kind of marginalisation and this silence that she's been condemned to. But we'll speak a bit about that later on when we're analysing the quotation. The first method I wanted to go through was pour my spirits. And this is liquid imagery. She's using a metaphor comparing her desires to some form of liquid that she's going to pour in Macbeth's ear, that she wants to pour in Macbeth's ear. And this was a form of Jacobean assassination, so pouring poison into someone's ear and then doing damage to them internally, which is essentially kind of a metaphor for what she wishes to do to her husband. She wishes to kind of eliminate him and destroy him, his weakness, and replace it with her own strong will. She also, another way of interpreting this phrase and this action is that she's kind of pouring her own spirit into him. She's using Macbeth as a surrogate body, as a kind of puppet to enact her own desires. As a woman, she wouldn't have gotten very far by herself, so she needs that male biology. She needs the male appearance of Macbeth in order to gain any status or any form of power and control. Second method, chastise, a verb meaning to punish, and it means to punish especially through beating. So here we see Lady Macbeth almost adopting this kind of maternal role in her influence of Macbeth. She sees herself almost like as a disciplinarian of Macbeth, a very forceful disciplinarian. We usually use the word chastise to describe kind of parents and the way that they deal with their children, and here it's almost like Lady Macbeth, you know, she obviously has no respect for her husband at all. She wishes to kind of change him and mould him into what she wants him to be. And we can see here, this is all part of that kind of psychological or systematic manipulation of Macbeth by Lady Macbeth. You know, parents will chastise their children, they'll discipline their children throughout the course of their life. And I get the impression here that when Lady Macbeth doesn't just manipulate her husband from this moment onwards, she has probably been manipulating him throughout their entire marriage. And it makes us question how much of Macbeth is really just him and how much of it is Lady Macbeth's influence. And in that way, perhaps we can be a little bit sympathetic towards her maybe most of Macbeth's achievements, or a large part of Macbeth's achievements, is actually due to the kind of spurring on of his wife, and she cannot claim any credit for that. So another way of looking at the complexity of her character. Lastly, valour of my tongue is a very masculine phrase. That valour means bravery, but it's a very masculine noun. And here we're blurring the distinction between what is masculine and what's female, indicating that kind of disorder that she's going to bring about in the play. And here, you know, what she's talking about is she wants to use her tongue to convince Macbeth, basically. So rather than being the silent female, she wishes to talk her way into kind of pushing Macbeth, which is a real struggle. You know, it's part of her consistent struggle against female convention. And what she does is she forces her way into the audience's focus. Is this play about Macbeth? Is it about Lady Macbeth? And she kind of shares the limelight with Macbeth, which is really unconventional of the time. You know, typically tragic heroes were men. And so when she says, you know, I want to kind of manipulate you with the valour of my tongue, she's characterising herself as the tragic hero in this play. She's forcing her way into the focus, which is quite interesting. Later, she says, later she kind of seeks out spirits in this scene, or in Act 1, Scene 7, and it characterises her in this kind of witch-like. This is in Act 1, Scene 5, where she seeks out spirits, and it characterises her in this witch-like light, and she aligns herself with supernatural forces. Shakespeare could be asking a question, you know, what do you value more? Is it the sanctity of your soul, or would you value power and control? Because that's the sacrifice. You sacrifice your soul if you want the kind of power that Lady Macbeth is seeking out here. But in hindsight, so as a contemporary audience, actually we might feel a little bit of sympathy, a little bit of pity for Lady Macbeth. Actually, she's already tried the whole sanctity of soul. She's trying to be a kind of typical housewife, and it's brought her nothing but isolation, you know, speaking alone in soliloquy. Perhaps this kind of ruthless ambition is born out of a frustration, like I said earlier, a frustration over her position as a Jacobean woman. The next quotation I wanted to speak to you about was actually a series of quotations. So I wanted to have a look at how Lady Macbeth kind of manipulates Macbeth. So from Act 1, Scene 7, I have given suck. I would have, so she's talking about a baby here that she has breastfed before, but she's saying, I would have still dashed the brains out of that child if I had promised you so. The second quotation is, the sleeping and the dead are but as pictures, which she says to Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 2, after, trying to reprimand him for refusing to return the daggers to the murder scene. And again, you see that kind of systematic manipulation of Macbeth. And she does this through attacking his masculinity or challenging his bravery. You know, in this quotation, when she says, I'd kill my child if I promised you I would, she's basically challenging him and saying, you know, I'm your wife and I still would have committed a heinous deed if I'd promised you it. So why aren't you as a man? And that, you know, challenging his bravery, using that to manipulate him, you might say, is Macbeth giving into his own pride, trying to make himself, his reputation with his kind of sense of identity more masculine, and so he's giving into his pride really. But she knew that she could use that to manipulate him. In Act 1, she says, the phrase here, give and suck, like I said, means to breastfeed. This serene maternal image, and it shows us that actually she has the potential to provide compassion. She has done in the past, probably had a child of her own. We don't know what happened to her child, and it makes us question, what would have happened if she fulfilled her maternal function? Would she have been as frustrated as she is now? Would she have been as wicked as she is now? Is the reason why she is so morally unhinged, is that because she lost a child? We don't know. Actually, we judge her as an incomplete entity. We know very little about her. And when we do that, when you judge someone without really knowing their past, perhaps this is a kind of a sympathetic, just a little nudge for sympathy when it comes to Lady Macbeth, that she may have lost her child, and we'll never know because she's a woman and she's not that important to the Jacobean kind of society. She says, I would have dashed the brains out. Obviously, that is a very violent violation of feminine codes. It would have been shocking and abhorrent to say that, especially as children and babies were seen as a very close to godliness. So, these kind of innocent, unspoiled vessels. But actually, she doesn't actually do that. This is a hypothetical. Meaning, she's saying I would have, and it's an imagined power. The only form of power that Lady Macbeth has is through her words and through her imagination. It will never be fulfilled in reality, and so again, we might say, even though this is a very terrible thing for a woman to say or for a mother to say, actually there is just this underlying sense that we might also pity her in some small way. In Act 2, that quotation that I chose, the sleeping and the dead are brothers' pictures. She's basically kind of insulting Macbeth. She's saying, why won't you go back? You're like a child. It's just an image, an image of violence that you're refusing to go back to. But actually what she's referring to is Duncan's death scene. So this really shows us her inability to comprehend the spiritual and emotional consequences of what she and Macbeth have done. She trivialises, she simplifies the consequences and repercussions as something concrete, a picture, something that you can easily leave behind. It's easily concealed. If we just leave the scene of crime behind, then that's it. It's past. It's done, and we won't suffer as a result of it. We can hide it. We can disguise it, as they do with the daggers on the guards. And what connects both of these quotes, other than the fact that they're manipulative, is the fact that they're both very physical. She talks about her relationship with this child. I've breastfed a child. She doesn't talk about anything. She says she has loved a child, but it seems as though she sees this physical act of breastfeeding as evidence of love, as evidence of emotion. And then she sees this kind of murder scene as a picture. They're both very physical ways of dealing with important emotional experiences. And it shows us that perhaps Lady Macbeth is quite emotionally immature. And maybe that's why she got herself into something that she really did not understand by helping to commit this regicide. Later, she's tormented by recurring images, so it's kind of a bit ironic, really. The images of blood are the things that kind of cause her her guilty torture in the last of her scenes, Act 5, Scene 1. And so the fact that she says, it's just a picture that you're talking about, and then she's tormented by recurring images, it's a little bit ironic in that sense. And the last scene I wanted to talk to you about, but with a couple of quotations, is Act 5, Scene 1. A really interesting scene, certainly psychologically. And I wanted to talk about these two quotations. Out, damn spot, out. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. And then the Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? So in Act 5, Scene 1, it's our final scene where we hear Lady Macbeth speak. But actually, Lady Macbeth has been alone since Act 3. She hasn't actually had a conversation with her husband since Act 3. So her life has been, again, encompassed by the isolation of Jacobean femininity, just totally marginalised and cast aside. And the sleepwalking in Act 5, Scene 1, somnambulism is its kind of more accurate name, but if you want to just say sleepwalking, that's absolutely fine too. It's her mind trawling back through the events of the play, leading up to Duncan's murder and after it. She's trying to comprehend her part in those in the sequence of events, really. Okay, so her mind is trying to comprehend it, trying to understand it. We could also, on a kind of more sophisticated interpretation perhaps, would be that she is actually going through a period of latent grief. And latent just means delayed, and this is a psychological condition. When someone suffers a very significant loss or trauma, the human mind sometimes is unable to actually process that pain and the power of that grief, and therefore it lies dormant in the mind, and then it will resurface later on, sometimes unexpectedly. So for Lady Macbeth, her repressed guilt or grief only surfaces in Act 5, Scene 1. She has now become emotionally wiser and understands or she's about to understand that guilt is a very real consequence of what she has done, but actually it's all a bit pointless now because she is going to die very soon. And her guilt and grief is just too powerful, too painful for her mind to process at the time of Duncan's death. There's also, we can go a little bit further with that, because actually disassociation is also another psychological condition. It's linked to this delayed grief. So disassociation is when you disassociate from the emotional experience. So from a trauma, you might kind of, a person might not even see themselves as in their body when they're going through something very traumatic, because again, it's the mind's coping mechanism for dealing with something very traumatic. And perhaps here, Lady Macbeth, before this scene, did disassociate with what she was going through. She was a very miserable woman, perhaps. It's suggested that, she is isolated while her husband goes off to battle. And perhaps, all of that kind of misery and depression has caused her to disassociate herself emotionally. So she's not emotionally engaging with anything before Duncan's death anyway. Perhaps she lost her child, as I said earlier, and so that's also why she really lacks the emotional capacity to feel any guilt over Duncan's death. I'm not really sure, but it's an interesting way of reading Lady Macbeth's character, and for us to understand why she was just almost completely evil at the beginning, where she, doesn't even feel any semblance of sympathy or pity for Duncan until she sees his body. So the first quotation, out, damn spot, out, all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this for hand. A few methods here. Obviously you've got the repetition of out, which suggests this kind of desperation. She's so tortured by that powerful grief. It's making her kind of stammer, and she's struggling to really comprehend the reality of her guilt and her involvement. So her mind is almost like stuttering. She can't understand it, and she's kind of stuck in a way. The repetition, and this line in particular anyway, it disrupts the iambic pentameter of her earlier speech. So iambic pentameter, as you know, 10 syllables, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, etc. It connotes orderliness and kind of things are the way they're supposed to be. So here, where it's completely disrupted, her mind has been completely fragmented and nothing is as it should be anymore. Then we've got, the word damned, kind of linking to this disruption. Damned means to be condemned to hell, and here Lady Macbeth is condemned to her own personal hell, and she realises now, and we realise, that hell is not just a physical state, it's internal and it's invisible as well. So all of Lady Macbeth's kind of superficial way, physical way of dealing with emotional events, actually now she's starting to realise that these things can sometimes be invisible as well. The two words are sweeten. So the verb sweeten reminds us of the traditional expectations of Jacobean women. They're meant to be pleasant, they need to be subservient and obedient, and kind of pleasing to be around. And here, Lady Macbeth is almost wishing that she could be that way. She could be sweetened. Is she trying to claw back any sense of kind of good and virtue that might be within her? It seems that way. She actually wishes she could just be a normal Jacobean woman now, and that's compounded by this diminutive little, which shows her kind of regression or disintegration. She no longer wants power. She would rather have the sanctity of her soul. And then this instance of her kind of washing her hands continually in this invisible blood, we could read as a form of rebaptism. She wants to renew her relationship with God, perhaps, but there is no water that she's washing her hands with, and it's only imagined in her mind. She has already severed that relationship. Second quotation, Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? So the Thane of Fife's wife is Lady Macduff, who Macbeth had slaughtered alongside her family. And Lady Macbeth is kind of here, first of all, feeling sorry for her her part in the kind of spiral of events. She didn't anticipate that Macbeth would kill the Macduffs. They'd only really agreed on Duncan, but the chain of events spiraled out of Lady Macbeth's control. So she feels sympathy for Lady Macduff, and guilty for her disappearance. But she also, so another way of reading this is she pities Lady Macduff's disappearance. Lady Macduff has essentially just disappeared into oblivion. No one will hear from her again. She's been completely silenced. And Lady Macbeth knows how it is to be silenced, perhaps, and she feels sympathy that she has caused that to happen to Lady Macduff. And it also reflects what will happen to Lady Macbeth. Later on, no one's even going to remember her, and none of this will have had any purpose whatsoever. Internal rhyme. Wife and Fife and wife, is kind of a bit nursery rhyme like, and it shows that she's reverting back into this kind of childlike state. She's been infantilized. Perhaps again we can interpret this as her attempt for a spiritual rebirth, her mind attempting to kind of start afresh, a bit like the rebaptism, but ultimately of course it's just impossible. She asked that question, where is she now? Now, obviously, we spoke about, she's asking that about Lady Macduff's and her disappearance, but she could also be asking this of herself. Where is Lady Macbeth now? Who even is she? There's this kind of loss of sense of self, and, it's almost quite pitiful. And I think at the very end of the play, we do sympathise to some extent with Lady Macbeth. But that's the kind of beauty of Shakespeare's plays, is that quite often you don't just like or dislike a character, you sympathise with them, but ultimately you realise that sometimes they are wicked and probably have suffered their just deserts, and that complexity of our relationship with Lady Macbeth is quite deliberate. And then just a kind of higher level way of reading this internal rhyme as well is this kind of echoing effect that it creates, almost like Lady Macbeth's words are echoing within herself. She's become this hollow shell, hasn't she? She's no longer really a person, and just this kind of empty coil, just like Macbeth at the very end. Macbeth is empty because he lacks any emotional capacity to feel sympathy or remorse. Lady Macbeth is an empty shell because she has been almost kind of completely destroyed by her guilt. So it's similar, but it's a little bit different as well, the process that they went through in order to become these kind of empty shells. Later on, at the end of this scene, later on in the play, in Act 5, she dies alone, but off stage, and we're not really certain how. A bit like Macbeth, she leaves no lasting legacy. Macbeth, all he has to say about her is that she probably would have died soon anyway. And so she has left no lasting impression upon the world, not even upon her husband. A word of warning from Shakespeare that actually regicide won't leave you the legacy that you kind of wished for. So what you're going to do from here on is to write a response to the question, how does the character of Lady Macbeth change throughout the play? You're going to write 2 paragraphs. And again, make sure that you explain the significance of the quotation that you have chosen, and what happens, why is it a pivotal moment in the character's transition, in Lady Macbeth's transition. Use your notes to do this, and don't just, again, follow those kind of empty sentence starters. You have to think and explain your ideas as well. Analyse 2 methods, at the very least, from each quotation using subject terminology, and you must link to context of the Jacobean women, of natural order, etc. Good luck.